October 1962, the world found itself on the brink of nuclear apocalypse. Soviet nuclear missiles were deployed in Cuba in close proximity to the Americans. Upon learning this, the United States was preparing a military operation that threatened to escalate into a global conflict. These events went down in history as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Panic gripped the world. The fate of humanity depended on whether the leaders of the nuclear superpowers would find a compromise. In American schools, children were taught what to do during a nuclear alert. Recently, Russian warships and a nuclear submarine appeared off the coast of Cuba again. In response, the U.S. authorities increased the military presence in neighboring Florida. Could the Cuban Missile Crisis repeat itself? Who really provoked the conflict 62 years ago? Why were Soviet missiles placed in Cuba, and how did humanity avoid catastrophe? If you like what we do, be sure to like this video and write a comment for our channel. Your activity helps us develop and make new historical analyses for you.
Uni-theory.
At the end of the 1950s, the Cold War was in full swing between the USSR and the USA. The sides fought for the expansion of spheres of influence around the world. The two nuclear powers avoided direct armed confrontation, but hybrid conflicts in third countries occurred constantly. One of these countries was Cuba, which at that time was striving for independence from the States under the leadership of Fidel Castro. In 1959, a socialist revolution occurred on the island. Thus, Cuba became the first communist state in the Western Hemisphere. The USA had an enemy only 180 kilometers from their border. Despite the regime change in the country, Castro initially sought to strengthen relations with neighboring states because the USA was the largest consumer of Cuban goods. However, American President Dwight Eisenhower did not accept the Cuban leader, citing being busy. Fidel considered this a personal insult. After the unsuccessful visit, Castro decided to carry out reforms against American dominance. At that time, they were the largest employers in Cuba, owned plantations and banks, and most importantly, they came to the island for cheap vacations and forbidden entertainments. Sugar was the most important source of income for the Cuban economy, so the first thing nationalized were 36 sugar factories owned by U.S. citizens. However, previous owners were offered packages of securities in exchange. Following this, Castro took telephone and energy companies, oil refineries, and branches of North American banks under Cuban control. In response to nationalization, the USA stopped supplying oil to Cuba and buying its sugar. All this put the island in an extremely difficult economic situation. The Soviet authorities watched the events in the Caribbean with no small pleasure and soon offered Cuba comprehensive support. Relations between the countries began to develop. In addition, Soviet specialists visited the island, for example, building steam power plants running on sugar production waste. For this, American intelligence used recruited Cubans who had fled to the USA. The largest operation took place in 1961. Armed saboteurs landed in the Bay of Pigs. Aviation was also involved, bombing air bases. Moreover, Cuban planes participated so that local military could not destroy them prematurely. According to participants of those events, even napalm bombs were used. In response to a sudden powerful attack, Cuban troops managed to hold back the enemy. To win, the saboteurs needed direct support from American military. However, the USA, not wanting to appear aggressors in the eyes of the whole world, decided not to engage in direct confrontation and denied all accusations for a long time. In addition to civilian products, Soviet weapons began to be supplied to the island. In response, the states broke off diplomatic relations with Cuba. In spring and summer of 1962, the USA conducted exercises near Cuban borders. By that time, the island's residents were already expecting that this show of force would soon turn into a direct confrontation. When the real threat of invasion hung over Cuba, Soviet General Secretary Nikita Khrushchev, according to eyewitness accounts, began to seriously worry about the fate of the allied country. Nevertheless, the delivery of missiles to Cuba was meant not only to protect the island of freedom, but, most importantly, to become a significant response to the deployment of U.S. missiles in 1961 in Turkey, which were literally 10 minutes flight time to Moscow. On May 21, 1962, Khrushchev raised the issue of deploying Soviet missiles in Cuba at a Defense Council meeting. The decision was supported almost unanimously. Only Mayan, the first deputy chairman of the USSR Council of Ministers, opposed it. On October 25th, at an emergency UN session, one of the most memorable scenes in the history of the organization unfolded. U.S. Representative Stevenson accused the USSR of placing missiles in Cuba and demanded an answer from Soviet Representative Zorin, who, like most Soviet diplomats, was not informed about Operation Anadir regarding the presence of missiles in Cuba.
Let me ask you one simple question. Do you
Ambassador Zorin deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no?
I am not in an American court and therefore do not wish to answer a question asked in a prosecutorial manner. Immediately after Zorin's response, Stevenson's aides brought enlarged aerial photographs of Soviet missile launch sites in Cuba into the Security Council chamber. The situation reached a boiling point. The Presidium of the CPSU Central Committee brought the Soviet armed forces to heightened combat readiness. At the same time, Kennedy issued a similar order. The combat readiness of the U.S. military increased to the penultimate level. For the first time in U.S. history, among the civilian population, real panic began. Hundreds of thousands of Americans rushed to seek safety at the border. Thousands of cars accumulated. The first step to resolving the conflict was taken by Moscow. This decision was not spontaneous. Despite Khrushchev's willful nature, the first secretary of the CPSU Central Committee, at a Politburo meeting on October 25, 1962, directly stated that the time had come to stop the standoff and look around. It took him considerable effort to convince the country's top leadership and army that concessions were not capitulation on our part. On October 26th, Khrushchev wrote a letter to Kennedy in which he first confirmed the presence of nuclear warheads in Cuba. In the letter, Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the launchers and return nuclear missiles to the USSR. In exchange, he demanded the removal of American missiles from Turkey and guarantees that the United States would not invade Cuba and would not support any other forces that could attempt an invasion. On the same day in Washington, ABC News journalist John Scully, close to the White House, met with Soviet intelligence officer Alexander Fomin, a KGB officer who orally conveyed Moscow's conditions and the essence of Khrushchev's statement. Scully immediately reported the meeting to U.S. State Department officials, who began seeking a diplomatic solution to the conflict. It seemed that peace negotiations should start at any moment. But at that moment, Fidel Castro, whose nerves were probably already frayed, ordered Cuban air defense to shoot down American planes. Reconnaissance planes circling the island around the clock, and the Soviets said, "We can no longer tolerate these flights. Our batteries are ready to open fire, and the Soviet side must know about this." While Moscow decided how to respond, the Cubans took action. On the morning of October 27th, local military began intensively firing at American U-2s, but during the shooting, none were hit. The commander of one Soviet anti-aircraft missile division reported to headquarters that an American plane had been spotted in his responsibility zone and requested permission to support the Cuban comrades with fire. However, leadership was not present at the time. Soviet military independently decided to shoot down the plane. The decision was made to shoot down the U-2 Soviet anti-aircraft gunners did not miss. The plane was destroyed. Pilot Rudolf Anderson died. Later, this incident went down in history as Black Saturday. Some researchers still have questions about this episode because in the U-2, there were inconsistencies. First, U-2 planes were equipped with a device to detect Soviet radars. Experienced Rudolf Anderson, having passed the Korean War, seeing he was under target, could have started maneuvering. However, he did not. According to one version, American military command sent Anderson on a mission with the safety system turned off. An attack on the reconnaissance plane should have been a reason for immediate military action against Cuba. In any case, a serious political scandal erupted. Khrushchev was furious, as it happened at a time when talks of peace were ongoing. The U.S. Army awaited commands, and the military headquarters were ready to open fire on the Island of Freedom at any minute. However, Kennedy did not yield to military pressure and again did not allow an attack on Cuba. The American president accepted Khrushchev's proposal to resolve the conflict. Kennedy promised not to invade Cuba, provided that the USSR removed its missiles from the island. As for missiles in Turkey, they were also promised to be removed, but over a longer period, allegedly requiring approval from all NATO countries, not just the USA. The American authorities gave the USSR 24 hours to consider the counter-proposal. Khrushchev agreed to the U.S. terms. At the peak of the conflict, many U.S. military personnel were extremely dissatisfied with their president's decision, considering it a defeat. They saw Cuba as a dangerous enemy in close proximity to American shores and wanted to strike it militarily at any cost. Castro also felt betrayed, as Khrushchev's decision did not take into account the interests of the Cuban people. "We will help our people build a bright future." During November, Soviet missiles were removed from Cuba under American supervision. 6 months later, the U.S. fulfilled its promise and dismantled missiles from Turkish soil. This episode marked the end of the sharpest phase of the Cold War. Relations between the USSR and the US began to thaw. Cuba was no longer under threat. A treaty limiting nuclear tests was signed, and a hotline between Washington and Moscow was established to protect against rash decisions in the Cold War. Whether the removal of missiles from Cuba was a victory or defeat for the Soviet Union remains debated. Researchers still do not understand why Khrushchev decided to place nuclear weapons in a friendly country secretly, even though it did not violate international agreements. The Americans openly deployed their weapons in Europe. In any case, the most important thing is that the leaders of the nuclear powers were able to stop in time. The events did not lead to a nuclear apocalypse. In June 2024, Russian ships again appeared near Cuba. Although officials called the presence of military vessels in Caribbean waters a friendly visit and assured that it should not be considered a precursor to a repeat of the 1960s crisis, many feared it might spark a new Caribbean crisis. Citing sources among U.S. authorities stated that Russia was sending ships and aircraft to Cuba for military exercises in the coming weeks. Allegedly, after the exercises, the ships would remain in the region until the end of summer, and in the fall, another phase of exercises would take place. The American side generally reacted calmly to the presence of military ships in the region, although it increased surveillance of the coastal area. According to local media, the U.S. military even deployed 3 guided missile destroyers, a Coast Guard ship, and a submarine detection aircraft. However, after the exercises, the Russian fleet left Cuban waters and continued its journey in the region. How close do you think the world is to nuclear war today, and is a repeat of the Caribbean crisis possible? Be sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. We would be very interested to know your opinion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to our channel, and click the bell so you don't miss new historical analyses. It was Uni Theory. See you soon.